Welcome to our presentation this evening. I'm Stephen Callowell, president of the Litchfield Historical Society. This is Matt Labby, who is the principal investigator for Monadnock Land Survey Archaeological Group.
Close enough.
Matt?
Thank everybody for coming out on such a dreary evening. I know there's not much else to do on a night like tonight. I'm pretty excited to be here. I actually grew up near the airport, so the history of this area has always been something that's pretty close to my heart. Ever since I started exploring the river as a little kid. I'm pretty sure I've read every book on this area and all the surrounding towns. So while this specific project only started in 2022, I've been working on this in some form or another for the last 30 years or so now. Before we jump into specifics of this work, I just wanted to speak briefly about what it is that archaeologists do, because it's a profession that's been somewhat sensationalized by popular media. Archaeologists are a type of anthropologist, a person who studies history or the history of humanity. And we do that through looking at the things that people left behind, artifacts, to learn about how they lived. So essentially, I'm a professional trash picker, and I'm pretty happy to say that. By looking at the things that people left behind and their relationships to each other in the soil, we can reconstruct past behavior as if each site was a very old crime scene. And this is especially useful in places where history is not recorded in documentation. This could mean times when writing didn't exist, as in the case of a pre-contact Native American site, or in the case of communities where people didn't have the autonomy to write down their own history, whether they were illiterate or enslaved or any other type of way that keeps you from getting your history down. So professionally, this work can take many forms. Often it's making sure that construction projects are in compliance with state and federal laws. Typically, it's surveying an area where historic resources are suspected and developing a plan to deal with them. Other times, it's monitoring construction sites to pick up details before sites are inevitably destroyed in the march of progress. Because the fact is we can't save everything, and so we collect the information that we can while we can, before it's gone. In the case of this project, it was an outgrowth of the town of Litchfield's conservation efforts, with implications for historic interpretation of its parks and for future tourism materials. History is an important part of creating a sense of community, but archaeology can help cement these ideas for the public by giving them something tangible to see. So archaeology is just as exciting as the movies because of the surprising information it can reveal. It's just not as adventurous. I'm not dodging booby traps or punching Nazis, but I do find some really neat stuff. I just have to fill out a bunch of paperwork, unlike my more famous counterparts. So as you can see, I am less Indiana Jones and more his less sexy cousin, Florida Jones. But one of the most important points that I can convey to you, because this is something that I hear all the time, is that archaeologists do not dig up dinosaurs. There's a different type of scientist called a paleontologist. So with that out of the way, we can start talking about this project specifically. Our company, Monadnock Archaeological Consulting, was approached in 2022 to conduct a survey of the town-owned property on the west side of Route 3A across from the Fire Station and Historical Society. There's a general knowledge that that area was among the earliest developed areas in town, with several exposed foundations and historical accounts of the nearby muster field, ferry landings, and most importantly, the site of the town's first meeting house and cemetery. So although it's just parkland today, this was a complex site with many historical features. And essentially, we were hired to look at these features and determine which, if any, had any historical significance, and what we should do about them so they could be avoided in the case of future construction. So we came out and we did some extensive background research on the site and conducted a small-scale excavation just to see if the various areas had an intact soil column. If an area has been previously dug up, it's difficult to interpret because the artifacts are not in situ, which is to say that they're not in their original context with each other. You need those spatial relationships to really analyze them properly. So I just want to give a little shout out to Steve here, who was really helpful with the background research. He passed along a lot of unpublished images and whatnot that were really helpful for the interpretation of the site, so I want to thank him for that. During the excavation phase, we put in several units near what we believe to be the meeting house, just to see if we could start narrowing down the location of the now missing cemetery, because that would cause the most problems going forward if there were any ground disturbing activity. We wanted to be absolutely sure that in the future, no work on the site would disturb any bodies. So we put several units up on the muster field as well, just to see if there was any evidence of those activities up there. And going into this, I really suspected that most of the landform had been churned up by the big floods in the 1930s. But what we actually found is that most of the soil column was intact, and there were artifacts throughout to a depth of about a meter below surface. So in the report to the town, the initial report, I wrote that we had determined the site was intact, but that we needed to do additional research to narrow down the location of the cemetery. And we recommended using ground penetrating radar to do that. So the town very generously approved of this work. But before I get into how that went, I want to take you through the history of the site, just to get an idea of how complex it is. And to do this, we need to go back before 1735 when the meeting house was built. And we actually really need to go much, much farther back than that, to 20,000 years ago, when Litchfield was buried under more than a mile of ice. I know sometimes it feels like this in January, but this is what it looked like all the time back then. It was the last glacial maximum. It was a time during the Ice Age when a sheet of ice stretched from the North Pole uninterrupted all the way down to Long Island, New York. And in fact, that island is actually formed by the edge of the glacier pushing up land. So all of the land in New Hampshire was likewise affected by this massive glacier, and we still see evidence of its effects on the landscape today. As the ice receded over the next several thousand years, it scoured the land, dropping our famous boulders and creating massive outwashes of sand across the landscape as meltwater and sediment began to accumulate. It also started to form our rivers and lakes. And among the largest of these was a body of water called Glacial Lake Merrimack, which formed in the current valley and stretched from Concord to Nashua. For the several thousand years that this lake existed, it was constantly filling with a fine clay sediment that underlies this entire area. And these deposits were later used to make the bricks that built the mills in our various mill towns. But for our purposes, it marked the deepest layer of soil that we needed to excavate, because naturally, people did not live where the town was submerged. So the natural dam that held that lake back eventually broke. It was located in Tingsboro, and the lake drained out, and it formed the Merrimack River more or less as we know it today. Soon after, the first humans arrived in New Hampshire. These were the Paleo-Indian people, and they were the ancestors of the modern Native Americans. They migrated here in small nomadic groups, just hunting herds of animals. There are sites around the state dating as far back as 12,000 years, so they have been here a very long time. And over the centuries, their descendants came to call this area home, and they lived here uninterrupted until European explorers started arriving here in the 17th century. There are sites all over the surrounding towns, and we could honestly have a whole lecture just about them. So we're not going to get into all of them tonight, but suffice to say, they were everywhere. So on the left here is a 1950s map by Chester Price showing known or suspected Indian trails, and you can see that Route 3A following the river is one of these. So that road has existed in one form or another probably for thousands of years. In addition, the river itself acted as a natural highway that you could navigate via canoe. So we know that the people that lived here were very mobile. New Hampshire was originally granted as part of Massachusetts, and surveys to find the head of the Merrimack River began in the 1630s. And the map on the right is a reproduction of one made in 1638, and you can see that the road is already marked out. During one of the last of these surveys, about 1650, it was reported that there were 40 native families on both sides of the river in this part of Litchfield, and they called this area Natticook, meaning open place of the deer. Just a few decades later, this number had dwindled substantially due to the hostilities of King Philip's War, which pushed many native groups up into Canada. Yet we see from the text on the right side that the remaining native groups were well aware of their ancestral claim over this land, and they wanted to keep it. This particular grant was for a piece of land roughly between the project area and the Manchester town line, with provisions for the islands in the river where Passaconaway spent time. And make no mistake, despite the appearance of legality, the colonization of this area was not a peaceful endeavor, and blood was spilled on both sides in the quest to take this territory from its original inhabitants. On the top left is the only definitive native artifact we required during the 2024 excavation. It's a stark point that was used as a knife, and it dates to 6,500 to 7,500 years old. It was found in disturbed context with some 18th and 19th century materials, so there's a good chance that there were intact pre-contact native sites here before the historic period when they all got churned up by all the various building campaigns. We also had these quartzite fragments that may be debitaged from making stone tools, but without an intact site, it's really difficult to say with any certainty. They're just unlike any other stone we found on the site, so we think they are probably pre-contact. But the knife itself does tell us unequivocally that people lived here, and there may be areas nearby that are still sensitive for Native American sites. And just as a note, this image of Passaconaway, it's not actually what he looks like. This is an imaginative depiction from the 1850s, and I've seen it attributed to other Native leaders in New England and other town histories. So it looks like a company came up with this and was shipping it around to all the different authors for their books. So take it with a grain of salt. In 1656, an 8,000-acre plot of land, including the whole of Litchfield, as well as parts of Merrimack and Londonderry, were granted to William Breton, who was a fur trader from England who became the president of Rhode Island and who was one of the original founders of Newport. The grant became known as Breton's Farm, even though there's no evidence that he ever lived here or even visited. He did, however, start selling off pieces of the land to various entrepreneurs, but there's no indication that any of them were settled, probably due to fears of Native American attacks, which occurred well into the 1700s. Eventually, most of Breton's Farm was incorporated into the grant for Dunstable in 1673, right around the time of Breton's death. And eventually, the Massachusetts government decided they wanted to encourage settlement of the area so that they could have more claim over the fish in the river, and so that they could use it as an artery for reaching the deeper parts of the state. So actual settlement began around 1720, and by the time the first survey map was completed in 1728, there were 16 individual landowners, but only 8 residents shown on the 1733 tax list, so even more sparse than today. This map is a reproduction of the 1728 version, and you can see the river has moved significantly since that time, and we're going to come back to that a little more later. Massachusetts established this area as a town in 1733, and if you start a new town, one of the first things you need is roads through it. So that is what the residents first started planning. They took the existing trail or bridle path, even then known as the Old Road, and widened and graded it in 1734. Other than getting a little wider over the years to accommodate cars and being straightened for safety reasons in some places, it's followed generally the same course since the 1720s, which I think is pretty fascinating. The next thing they needed to do was connect Merrimack to Litchfield, since they were both part of the same land grant. And since there were no bridges, that had to be accomplished by ferry, a series of small boats that took people, animals, and goods across the river, since it was too deep to cross on foot. So the ferry in this location was organized around 1740 and continued in use till the first decade of the 20th century. The ferry was located at the center of town, and it was also located along a post road that linked Amherst to Portsmouth. It was originally known as Cummings Ferry for its first owner, then Lutwyche's Ferry, and finally Thornton's Ferry by 1790. And because the river moved on occasion, the ferry landings themselves moved over the years. And we know this because it's shown in different places on the various maps and artworks of the area. At least one of these is still visible at the north end of the project area today, where there's still some stairs and associated railings from the very last ferry landing. We can also see it geologically in some instances, as on this LiDAR view in the top right. LiDAR uses lasers to map the landscape, and it's a great way of seeing the landform as it would look if there was no vegetation. So it's actually great for finding historic sites. Litchfield and Merrimack were split after New Hampshire separated from Massachusetts in 1741. Surprisingly, there were more people living in Litchfield at the time, so the people on the west side of the river were really inconvenienced by having to cross the river to come to church and to meetings, and so they decided they wanted a town of their own, which eventually became Merrimack. The ferries were subsidized by the towns, but were ultimately privately owned, because someone had to maintain the boats and the storage sheds and all the infrastructure for this kind of thing. So very little is known about the first ferry owner, Jonathan Cummings, who purchased the land on the west bank of the river in 1739, but we do know that he chartered specifically with the state of Massachusetts, so he had to get a new charter when the two states separated. A lot more is known about its second owner, Colonel Edward Lutwyche, who purchased it in 1763. And it turns out the colonel was a very good officer, but he became a real problem during the Revolution because he was an ardent British loyalist. and almost everyone in Merrimack and Litchfield was a patriot. And so suffice to say, he was not a popular man. When the British attacked Lexington in 1775, he refused to call his militia unit, and he actually fled to Boston in the middle of the night to join up with the British. And he never returned to Merrimack. He eventually was forced to move to Nova Scotia after the war. And as a trader, his property, including the ferry, was seized by the colony. But he had left his mother behind in his house, and she had to go to court and say, I actually have the right to still live here. I haven't done anything wrong. And they were forced to give it to her. And she continued to operate the ferry until her own death in 1778. So Colonel Lutwidge would have probably have been very annoyed to learn that after her death, the ferry was sold to Matthew Thornton. And if that name sounds familiar, it's because he was one of those pesky signers of the Declaration of Independence, which Colonel Lutwidge thought was treason. So Thornton took possession of the ferry for only a short time before selling it to his son, also named Matthew Thornton, which is why we keep the name today. But Matthew Jr. actually died only a year after his father, so it wasn't actually in their possession for very long. And their house is still standing today. It's the Common Man restaurant in Merrimack. And some of the older of you may remember it as the Hannah Jack Tavern, which was the name of Matthew Thornton's wife. And I'm told it's haunted, but I don't believe any of that nonsense. But we do know there was a Thornton suicide there in the early 1800s, so who knows? After the Thorntons gave it up, it passed through many, many owners. We actually don't have time to get into all of them tonight, but if you go and read the 2022 report, I give a much more thorough history of that part. Because after the road network, the town needed a meeting house, and this, as you'll see in a bit, was the primary focus of this year's excavation. The meeting house is exactly what it says it is. It's a place to meet for town meetings, church services, but also for social events. You know, if you were going to have a wedding or something, you know, maybe you'd have it there. It was the center of life in town if you weren't at the tavern. Basically, a place where you could be proper. So the town approved construction of a meeting house in August 1734, specifying that the building was going to be 45 feet by 35 feet in size and 25 feet tall. And these measurements, as you'll see, actually came in really handy when we did this year's work. As with most towns, there was a big debate over where to put it, and it took over a year to find a suitable location. But the land was finally granted by a woman in Newport by the name of Martha Church. She did not appear to have lived here, and we don't actually know what her connection was, but her ownership was likely related to the original grants from Breton Farm, which you recall was kind of focused around the Newport area as well. The building was completed in 1736, but they initially had trouble finding a pastor. Apparently they couldn't afford to really hire anyone. Instead, they relied on traveling preachers who made circuits of the area towns. Eventually, they settled on Joshua Tufts, who was ordained in 1741, and he stayed here for about 3 years. Based on the deed research we did, it appears he had a house very close by to the meeting house, but we don't know precisely where that was located. And then the town took its current name of Litchfield in 1749, so a few years later. So after its construction, almost nothing more is said about the building in early records other than we know it was repaired in 1800 instead of building a new structure. There are no known purposefully drawn artistic representations of the building, and it was torn down before photography became really common, especially for outdoor scenes. So we really don't know much more about it than its dimensions. We can say that it probably didn't have a cellar because the stone needed to build it was not common on the sandy terraces on this part of the riverbank, thanks to that glacial lake that we talked about before. And based on the excavation, we think it may have been underpinned with like loose brick or whatever loose stone they could have found around the area. We do know that it did not have a steeple because it's something that Henry David Thoreau mentions in his book. And the only known image of it, to my knowledge, is this 1805 town map. And even that's not a very graceful depiction. But Thornton's Tavern is still standing, and we know that that depiction is pretty accurate. So I think we can assume that the meeting house depiction is probably pretty close as well. From the deed research, we also see references to other nearby structures, including a tanning yard, a blacksmith shop, a shoe shop on the east side of the road, and several 18th century houses right nearby. So this was an active area from day one and was even more developed than it is today. Almost nothing about the cemetery is known other than that it was located behind the meeting house. Most likely the earliest graves did not have stone markers since that wasn't common at the time it was laid out. They probably used wooden markers instead or even just rough stones. We do know, however, that its location was very problematic. Reportedly, sometime before 1850, the river shifted course as the result of a flood and eroded away parts of the original cemetery, taking bodies, coffins, and whatever stones were there with it. And in fact, if you visit the cemetery across the street, you can see at least 6 stones that date between 1776 and 1804, even though that cemetery wasn't established till about 1810, just after the Presbyterian Society was established. So we suspect that these were stones that were recovered from the old cemetery and then moved across the street. So we don't actually know if there are even bodies under some of those. As you can imagine, a corrupted cemetery has also encouraged a number of ghost stories about the area, most of which focus on the idea of a lost lover looking for the remains of their partner. Whether it's fact or folklore, I'll let you decide. We can say, however, that the original location was forgotten by the time the county map was published in 1856, since it was not marked at that time. South of the meeting house was the location of the muster field. Colonial New England had no standing armies, and so the local communities had to form militias that could be raised to defend the towns as needed. This necessitated training, and the muster field is where people met to practice their maneuvers or to partake in the annual muster day drills, which acted as sort of a town fair. There's actually a quote about musters in Goffstown that sums up the atmosphere pretty well. It's, quote, "Long before dawn, the thoroughfares were alive with men, women, and children, soldiers and civilians, peddlers, fakers, and showmen, some on horseback and some in carriages, all anxious to witness or participate in the first act of a great military drama," end quote. So lots of drinking was done during these events. And so sometimes, especially in the afternoons, fights would break out. This would occasionally lead to criminal activity and even murders in some cases. There was a famous murder in Goffstown in the 1830s. And over the years, these became focused way more on entertainment than training. So they weren't really a big part of defense after that point. We believe that the field in Litchfield started to be used for musters around 1750. And it was almost certainly in use at the start of the French and Indian War, which began just 4 years later. It's mentioned by name in a 1760 journal entry by Matthew Patton of Merrimack, who went there to witness the muster of John Goff's troops, from where we get the name Goff's Falls. These events continued annually until the militia system was phased out at the tail end of the 19th century. And after that, this field was used exclusively for agriculture up until about the 1960s or so. We did do some excavations there in 2022, but we found very few artifacts. And those that we did find, we couldn't tie directly to the muster because they really wouldn't be any different than what you would use on a day-to-day basis. There have been some big changes to the muster field over the years in terms of erosion, but also from the 1936 flood, which caused a big washout that we can see on the LiDAR survey on the right side of the map. But still, because there was never buildings up there, as far as we can tell, it's an area that we think that still could be sensitive for Native American sites. The meeting house stopped being used for religious services in 1844 when the Presbyterian Church was built across the street. And the cemetery had likely already been abandoned by this time, since the new cemetery went in about 1810. And a major flood around 1850 necessitated the construction of a new meeting house across the street in 1851. And that is now the Historical Society. So the original building was disassembled, and several elements from it, including the doors, framing timbers, and the granite steps, were incorporated into the construction of the new building. And this meant that almost no trace of the original building would have remained except for the artifacts that had been left around its perimeter and whatever underpinnings had been left in place. During the late 19th century, the area continued to be used for residential lots. There were at least 3 houses standing north of the meeting house site. The Horse Shed Foundation, which is this far one, was built around 1914 on the site of an earlier residence, which itself was built on the site of the 18th century blacksmith shop. So we have a lot of turnover on the types of buildings in this area. But otherwise, very little else is known about the horse sheds. There was also a schoolhouse south of the project area where the road bends, but that was a little outside the scope of our work, so we haven't checked it out, but I have heard there's a foundation out there for that. So all of this was submerged during the flood of 1936. And this caused over $1 million in property damage up and down the valley, and that's in 1936 money, so it's a lot more than now. So I was very concerned that this flood had hammered the soil on the site and caused a lot of erosion that would have really affected our ability to see what happened early on in the site's history. But in fact, we learned that was not the case. The flood had actually deposited several inches of sediment across the entire site. So the soil above that is the overburden that was from tearing down the other houses in the 60s and from the overgrowth of the parkland from the 60s to the 2010s when the land was cleared again. So that kind of brings us up to today. When we did the 2022 excavation, we knew we were close to the meeting house site because we were finding 18th century artifacts. But at the end of the project, we still weren't clear exactly where it stood or where any possible human remains for the cemetery were located. So we recommended to the town that we continue with additional research and excavation. And so I began that work this spring, and I did that by digging deeply into the deeds for all the surrounding parcels to look for clues about where to search and hopefully some defined measurements that we could use to figure it out. But I found pretty quickly that the biggest problem was the river itself. Because while we may think of the river as unchanging, it was constantly moving due to floods and erosion and other factors. So, for example, the 1805 map notes specifically that the river at the ferry was 825 feet wide. Today it's only about 520 feet wide, and that's because of buildup on the Merrimack side of the river. So this was the primary problem in locating where the cemetery was originally. The riverbank had moved and the parcels had literally changed their shape over the years. So the most useful map we had was this 1920 lot plan because it was very easily scalable to the modern tax maps. And you can see that the lot marked graveyard and the meeting house in front of it are far smaller than the 1.5 acres listed in the original deed. And so as a little spoiler, neither is where we found evidence of the meeting house either. So that's marked by the large dark square below the old ferry road. So this meant that the lot had clearly been subdivided over time in addition to whatever soil loss had come across it. So the other problem was that the original deed didn't list any specific boundaries or measurements. So it was kind of as if the townspeople just knew she meant all of the land on that side of the road and everybody just accepted it. We would never do that today. So just as a little thought and geometry experiment, I just started playing around with lot calculations, looking at the surrounding parcels to see what it would take to make up that 1.5 acres. And the long story short is this is what I came up with. If you include the Musterfield lot and the two lots to the north, the total acreage gets much closer to that 1.5 acre total, and it puts the meeting house right in the center of the lot where you would expect to find it. It also covers most of that 40 rods of soil loss mentioned in the 1885 history, if we assume that means linear feet along the shoreline. And so that would leave us with about 10 to 20 feet of shoreline loss from 1850 to 1920, depending upon whether you include those top two lots or not. And I put in the modern shoreline and riverbank as well, so you can really get an idea of how this cemetery was lost in chunks over the years, just at regular intervals. And as I said, this is a thought experiment, and I don't know if my geometry is that great. Maybe we do it a little different if you're going to try again. But I think the concept is sound for establishing why we have so much loss of the shoreline over time. So with the information in the deeds, as well as our general historical knowledge, it was time to go out in the field this spring with our GPR system to see if we could actually find any remaining graves. GPR stands for ground penetrating radar, and it's exactly what it sounds like. This device uses radio waves to see what is below the surface. So the machine kind of looks like a lawnmower, and it's used the same way. You just run it up and down the line, and it shoots a pulse into the soil, which bounces back at different speeds depending upon the density of what's below it. And it's displayed on the computer screen in real time, which allows us to get an idea of buried features as well as soil changes and buried stones. So anywhere you see like a shadow like this means a buried feature. So this is probably like a big boulder or something. And then this is probably part of the meeting house foundation. So this is our sample readout. It's shown as a cross section of the soil. So if you imagine you just dug straight down and you were looking at the wall, that's what you would be seeing. I kind of wish it was a little more obvious what you were looking at, but maybe someday the technology will get there. So in these pictures, you can see our friend Kevin from Horizons Engineering using a machine. Every time he found an anomaly, he would place a pin flag down, and I would go around and record its position with a GPS device so that we could plot it on our maps. And that left us with this final map. So this is our collection of anomalies. It looks pretty random, right? It's just a cluster of blobs. It doesn't really appear to show much, and it definitely doesn't look like the orderly lines you would expect from a cemetery, right? But when I looked at this, I saw something a little bit different. I saw a big gap in the number of anomalies at the south end of the site. And it got me thinking about something that I wrote in the 2022 report, which is that wherever the meeting house stood, you wouldn't expect to find artifacts under it. You would expect to find them around it. And so I got to wondering if this blank spot was where our meeting house stood. And so I went ahead and I measured it. And sure enough, it came out to exactly that 35 by 45 foot measurement for the meeting house, the exact known size of the building. And this got me really curious because a lot of the anomalies were clustered around the perimeter of the structure, and even one very close to the exact center of the building. And I wondered if perhaps what we were seeing was the remains of underpinning that might have been stone below the soil used to hold up the timbers of the building. And so, since we didn't have any indication of burials, but we did have an idea where we could focus our excavation, I decided I was going to explore that theory. So originally we had planned to place a line of shovel test pits across the entire landform to see if we could intersect a structure. But the GPR survey gave us a much tighter area to search, and I was able to focus with fewer test pits and blocked into larger areas so that we could really get a cross-section of the soil. And you can see here that our excavation units from 2022 were actually very close to the building foundation, and I will let you attribute that to my skill, but really it was just blind dumb luck. So we ended up placing 7 shovel test pits. These were each 50 centimeters square, but we placed them in blocks to see if we could get a cross section of the soil across the footprint of the building. And that way we'd hopefully be able to see in the soil what was related to the architecture of the building and what was later disturbance from the 19th and 20th century changes to the landform. So we do our excavation with hand shovels. And the soil gets sifted through 1/4-inch wire mesh screens so that we can easily see and catalog the artifacts as they come up. We slowly take each unit down in 10-centimeter levels so we can document changes in the soil, but also the changes in artifacts from level to level. And this allows us to put things into better context, which I'll touch on more in a little bit. Sometimes we also do things out of order, as you'll see on this side. And really that's just for ease of excavation. Sometimes it's easier when you have to get the shovels into a narrower area to take it however you need to. So the placement of the, it took us 2 days to do all of our excavation, which I thought was pretty good. We were expecting almost a week, but it went pretty quick. So the placement of the units ended up being ideal though, because we not only found some really nice artifacts in every single unit that covered the entire history of the property on the site, but we were also able to find some direct evidence of the meeting house itself. So in both sets of units, about 75 centimeters below the surface of the ground, we started seeing these very dark square stains in the soil, right where the anomalies were recorded by the GPR unit. And it went right down to the top of that glacial soil I mentioned earlier on in the presentation. We also found small brick fragments packed around them inside different colored soil than we normally see at that depth. Very unusual. So we realized pretty quickly that what we were seeing were post molds. These are either decomposed remains of posts or areas where posts were removed and backfilled with darker colored topsoil. So I mentioned earlier that the building likely did not have a foundation, and this is probably why. During the first period of settlement, one of the common construction techniques was called earthfast. You would just take your posts and drive them directly into the ground for stability rather than supporting it with stonework, because there weren't a lot of stonemasons at the time. And so the dark soil we were seeing represented the posts, and the lighter soil around them represented the trench that they dug to insert the post, which was packed with broken brick and whatnot for stability. So we know that brick was shipped across the river on the ferry, so this could very well be waste that was being reused. You know, these people are very green, use what you got. And these post molds also lined up directly with our expected building footprint, which was noted in the GPR anomalies. So the running theory is that the meeting house was an earthfast structure, and because we didn't find any wood remains in the stains, and we found some deformations in the shape of them, we believe that when the building was disassembled in the 1850s, the post was pulled out, and then backfilled with soil from the surface to prevent holes. The soil levels above 75 centimeters were mixed up during the late 19th and early 20th centuries, which is why we don't find this soil staining further up in the soil column. So theoretically, we would find stains like this all around the perimeter of the building in a square if you were to excavate the whole area, and possibly along the center lines of the building, which could easily explain our anomaly at the center of the building. So this is a really good example of how it's not always the artifacts that give us clues about the history of the site. It's the soil itself sometimes. And there's really a lot to see in the soil at this site. So this is a typical soil profile we see on this site. Actually, it was unusually consistent from unit to unit, but that's really good because it makes it a lot easier to interpret. And I like to talk chronologically, so I want to start from the bottom and work my way upwards. So at the very bottom is that gray glacial lake bed we talked about. And above that was this really dark, greasy silt with like flecks of burnt wood in it. And it looks like very much when they were clearing the site to build the meeting house, what they did was just burn the site clear and then plow it over to pull up all the roots and whatnot. It's just a fast and easy way of getting the site clear. Above that in level 5 is where we started finding artifacts. One of the most easily datable artifacts from the earliest period is pipe stems. People smoked tobacco through clay pipes, and the diameter of the bore of the pipes got smaller over time, so we can give them a relative date by measuring the size of the borehole. We also found some Buckley glazed redware, which dates from about 1720 to 1750, which is right when the meeting house was constructed. Above that, we start to get into the familiar datable ceramics of the late 18th and 19th centuries. The transition between the dark colors and the light colors is about the period where the meeting house was demolished. There appears to be a flood layer below it. It's really hard to see in this picture, but it was a lot more obvious when you were there on the day. Sometimes the sunlight doesn't help the photographs. So we know that there were buildings built after the meeting house came down, so there does appear to have been some measure of land grading to put down new soil. And in fact, we occasionally found 18th century material in that post-1850 layer, probably because of the construction of the houses nearby. You know, they would dig out the cellar and throw the dirt down. And so sometimes you get older stuff on top. We also found a huge amount of melted glass and metal slag. Much of that was much in the upper layers. And again, we think that was from the blacksmith shop, which dated to the 18th century. They were digging it out and throwing it down the hill. If you come up later, I've got some of the artifacts and bags up here, and you'll be able to see some of that stuff. And then finally, in the top layers, we have the 1930s flood sediment and the soil that accreted from being overgrown for nearly half a century between the 60s and the 2010s. I'm not sure exactly how much plowing they did to pull up all that vegetation. I don't know if anyone remembers, but I would imagine it was pretty disturbed by pulling out tree roots and whatnot. Identifying these soil layers is really where the artifacts come in handy. You can put datable artifacts into a depth chart to kind of get a sense about which layers are from which period and which have been moved around after they were deposited. So during this phase of excavation, we recovered 822 artifacts, and I would say that the bulk of these were architectural remains like nails and window glass and brick fragments that often don't give you much of a date. Nails can be helpful. We can usually get those within 50 to 100 years, but in general, architectural stuff isn't very helpful. We did find that the material from the early 1800s was pretty jumbled up, as if the land around the meeting house was very muddy and all the animals tramping around was just like turning over the soil year after year. And this also leads to smaller artifacts overall. We call them getting chums, we call them kibble, like dog kibble, because things get broken up and they get spread apart by this kind of action. When you have a deliberate dump, you get much bigger pieces. So I just wanted to put a few artifact highlights up here. On the bottom left is my favorite. It's a halfpenny dated 1745, so only 10 years after the meeting house was built. This one was extremely worn, so it was probably in circulation much later than its date of manufacture. And these were used up till the end of the French and Indian War when George II died, so up until about 1760 or so. Unfortunately, it was found in mixed context with 19th century material in the upper layers of soil. So it was probably from the blacksmith shop area and not directly from the meeting house. On the upper right, we have an artifact that was found in the very first shovelful of STP-1. And there's this tiny, tiny glass fragment that we were actually able to match to a specific shop in Keene. And its presence above the level of the 1936 flood indicates that this is something that was pushed downhill from near the road, that it wasn't in its original position. It's just really rare that we can tie something like this to a specific manufacturer and give it a really tight date. So it really just goes to show how integrated statewide trade networks were by the early 19th century. And features like the ferry in this location let material like this travel across towns across the state and to places around the region. So people were mobile and stuff was getting around. And in the lower right is 6 pieces of a bowl that I was able to reassemble from multiple levels of soil. This is pretty typical of the elegant but not expensive wares typical of the early 19th century middle class, for lack of a better term. We don't really call them middle class, but that's what they were. It does show, however, evidence of the soil being turned over a lot because we have one large fragment that was broken up and spread into multiple holes over time, and we were able to reunite them. So a large piece like this was probably deposited in a specific trash heap that was disturbed during later construction. So that brings us to the end of excavation, and I just want to tie it all up with a few conclusions. There is definitely a native presence before the 18th century, which date back at least 6,500 years, and likely several thousand years earlier than that, all the way back to at least the formation of the river. We see it in both the artifacts and in features like Route 3A, which was an Indian trail. We also have several new clues about the history of the meeting house itself that aren't found in documentation. We have evidence of land clearing by burning. We have the post molds, which show an earth-fast structure, and the lack of recovered wrought iron nails suggest a building that was built using mortise and tenon joints rather than joinery, because blacksmiths weren't very common in the 1730s. We also found no evidence of the cemetery. It appears to have been entirely washed away. Documentation suggests it was out of use by about 1810 and almost entirely destroyed by 1850. Soil erosion actually came nearly to the back of the meeting house structure. You can see how close it is. So we think they were probably really worried that the whole thing was just going to pitch into the river, and that's why they built the one across the street. There's also archaeological overburden from multiple 18th to 20th century buildings that stood near the meeting house site. So this was a really active and developed area, far more than it appears today. I don't think anyone realized how much stuff went on in such a small area. And finally, despite changes to the landform over the years, the remains of the meeting house structure are still preserved in the soil there and need to be avoided during future construction. We really don't want people digging there because the way this structure is situated is very ephemeral. If you dig up that soil in the wrong way, we lose all trace of it. So we have recommended a buffer to prevent digging around the structure. We do suspect that some of this section has already been destroyed, so keeping this part intact is even more important. So I just want to thank everyone here in town for being so welcoming and encouraging, and really thank you for having us on this project. This has been great. Oftentimes people either have no interest in stuff like this, or sadly, they're sometimes even hostile about it. So it's always nice to have a town that cares about their history. I love that. And with that, I will open it up to questions, although I won't promise you'll like the answers.
I apologize for destroying the beginning of this back in 2010.
We'll give it. These things happen. And for me, I don't really care about anything before.
I cleared the brush out of this.
Yeah, I don't care about anything after the 20th century. I just want the really old stuff.
Could you say a little bit about how much land was lost due to erosion?
We know at least 10 to 20 feet, but I would wager it's probably upwards of double that. And I don't think we'll ever have a permanent answer, because what happens is I actually took the historic maps and I overlaid them on the modern USGS maps. And what we find is that while the historic maps show the villages accurately scaled, the space in between is not. And so you can't really lay them on and get a sense of where the river was. They weren't directly measuring it out. So I don't think we'll ever know.
But we do know that one of my ancestral homes was lost.
Yes, so the Chase House? Griffin House, I'm sorry. Yes, there was a house located at the bend in the ferry road. We just don't know if the scale on that 1856 map accurately shows where it is. And I don't think we'll ever know, unfortunately. You had one?
Yeah, so usually erosion would mean that the river would get wider.
Yep.
But what you're telling me is that the river is narrower now than it used
It
to.
depends. I like to think of it more like when you're in the shower and you watch the water drops go down the wall, they kind of zigzag over time, right? And so the river just kind of shifts back and forth over the years. And so sometimes soil's deposited, sometimes it's pulled away, but the overall shape changes over time. So to say it's wider or narrower it's kind of dependent upon when you're looking at it.
In the cross section of the dig hole that you posted,
Yep.
there was a huge, the 1836
Yep.
flood was the little
That's where the post
light
was.
line.
Yeah.
And then there was a big sandy line in the middle.
Yep.
Why
So
so much in the middle there?
that big sandy line in the middle is just normal soil accumulation, but what happens is over the years, all the organic stuff is leached out of it and it gets lighter in color. So it doesn't necessarily mean that anything light is a flood. It's just the 1936 flood layer is so distinct and it's much finer than the other soil that's there.
It's that white kind of
Yeah,
sand.
it's really, really fine.
How does your organization intersect with New Hampshire's Archaeological organization in Concord?
Well, we're pretty much all members, but what happens is essentially the archaeological guidelines are set by federal legislation. The National Historic Preservation Act in 1966 laid out the idea that each state has its own division of historic resources. And so they lay out the policies and procedures that we have to follow, and we submit our reports to them for approval and whatnot.
When the graveyard was moved, did they move the bodies as well?
I don't think they did. I suspect that most of the remains were washed downstream and they salvaged headstones where they could.
They actually did.
Did they?
Yes, they about
Like I would imagine anything that hadn't been washed away they could have dug up and moved.
in beginning before the Civil War in the 1850s.
Yeah.
During the summers, the town was conscripting young men to go and work at this site. And they exhumed bodies and stones, and that's when the 3 cemeteries came into
It's
existence.
a great way to do it.
And
So they obviously knew this was a problem that was coming.
yes, because they had also gone to the state and tried to talk the state into building a levee.
Yeah.
To direct the flow, and they
Direct the flow to Merrimack and watch.
Exactly.
and we would have
You
gotten
say that
more
like
land.
it's a bad thing, Jason.
But there was a levee in Nashua, so I'm curious how that turned out. That might have been later, though. I don't actually know.
Did help us.
These are great questions. I never get good questions. Go ahead.
You talked a lot about the meeting house and stuff, but you didn't talk a lot about the Native Americans.
Yep.
What you found as far as artifacts.
Just that one knife blade and then the
Just
2
one.
quartzite fragments. So what it looks like is, typically a native site will look like either, a fire pit in the soil. And so when you build a historic building, the land gets turned over and the stuff gets turned over and you can't really tell where stuff used to be. They didn't build with stone, so it's not like you have foundations and stuff. And so native sites back in the day, no one cared. They would just dig them up and they'd say, oh, we found 3 skulls and we threw it in the trash. And it's really tragic. So a lot of our native history has been lost. And so that's why we always want to preserve areas that look like they could be sensitive, like the mustard field, because there still could be stuff there we just don't know. And we won't know unless we test it. Oh, I think that's pretty much it.
No, I have one.
Yeah.
Could you talk about what are the 3 best things that you found? Can you
For me,
describe
I loved the coin. We got so excited. We got so excited over the knife blade because I'm
How
not.
big was the knife?
Yeah, it's here. So I am not a person who studies Native American stuff, but my coworker that day was, and he about lost his mind. So this is made of rhyolite. It's a stone that comes from eastern Maine, and they had actually really big trade networks. What they would do is chip off a huge piece of rock, and then you'd bring it to your family reunion down the river, and you'd trade it for some beads or whatever, and these things would spread all over the region. So you find stone from Jefferson, you find stone from Munsungan up in Maine, you find it all over New England. It's great. For me, I like a lot of the really fine ceramics. I don't think I have any obvious here. Maybe this one. They would use this beautiful cobalt blue tin in the early 1800s. It probably caused a lot of cancer and stuff, but it just looks so nice. And then the coin is here, and this was almost illegible. I had to get it wet and look at it under a magnifying glass to even figure out who it was or what it was. It was really used.
That's the half penny.
Yep. It's very big, half penny, right?
It's like a quarter.
Excuse
Excuse me, I dropped that.
Oh, did you?
He's old enough.
What's the biggest one?
The biggest is probably, we've got a couple full bricks, and we don't usually save that stuff because nobody wants to catalog it. There's a big problem in this state of where do you send your artifacts? So if they don't go back to the client like they're going to do here, they're going to go to the Historical Society. They go up to a warehouse in Concord, and you have to pay like $500 per box to store artifacts there. So there's real incentive not to keep things that can't be studied in the future. I mean, what kind of study are you going to do on a brick? And then the metal stuff, like the nails and stuff, no matter how much you clean them, they will dissolve because there are salts in the soil. And so even in the last couple months, a lot of these have started re-rusting after we've cleaned them. They're breaking down. So metal's really, really hard to save.
My car is the same way.
Absolutely. Salt in New England in the winter, man.
Yeah.
You can't.
Well, thanks again for having me. This was great.
Thank you. And artifacts are on display up here if you'd like to come up and have a look. And if Matt, you have any questions, Matt's here to answer.
Well, after an hour, people start looking. I didn't notice anybody.
They have Indian artifacts in
Yeah.
Well, my boss specializes in native stuff, so he usually does everything. And most states have a tribal historian to do the yeah, New Hampshire doesn't have one though because New Hampshire does not have a federal. Vermont does, Maine does.